Hey guys, welcome back to the Curly Reader. My name's Amanda, and today I would like to share with you a book review of As Bright as Heaven by Susan Meisner. Now, this book was released originally in 2018, so I know I'm a little bit late to the game here, but recently this has gotten a lot of traction because it is a historical fiction book that centers around the Spanish flu outbreak in Philadelphia in 1918. And so a lot of people have been reading this because it correlates with the coronavirus pandemic, or it correlates. Did I say that right? I don't know. Anyway, but so this has been getting recommended a lot. A lot of people have been reading this lately, and so I thought I would share my thoughts because I just finished reading it. So I recently read this as a buddy read with Krista from Books and Jams and Katie at Life Between Words. We all read this together right at the beginning of May. And this is the story of the Bright family. It is a story of mom and dad and three daughters. They have recently lost a younger son, the parents. They had an infant son that passed away when he was like 6 months old, I think. And so the mother is dealing, well, the whole family, but really the mother is dealing with a lot of grief about that. So that's something that happens right at the very beginning, the first chapter. You find out about this. So that's happening. And then after the death of their son, they decide that they are going to move to Philadelphia from rural Pennsylvania. And they are going to live with the husband, Thomas, with his uncle who runs an undertaker business. He's an undertaker. And Thomas is going to go and become kind of his second in command and take over the business, once he dies because the uncle has no descendants. So he's looking to pass his business on to somebody. Thomas ends up being that person. And so they move the whole family into Philadelphia. And this is just a few months before the Spanish flu really hits Philadelphia hard. And so through this is told in multiple perspectives. You get the mom's point of view and you get all three daughters' point of view. So the daughters at the beginning of the story are 15, 12, and 7, I believe. So we get each of their points of view. And one of the things that I really, really loved about the writing in this is that each of the characters has a very distinct voice. Even the writing style, like the 7-year-old has much like shorter sentences and it's more staccato, and the mom is just way more in depth and in tune with her emotions. And I really appreciated seeing that change from character to character in the way that their thoughts are being processed. And even amongst the 12-year-old and the 15-year-old, you're seeing that age difference in the writing. And so I really love that. And this book really explores the topic of grief and the topic of death. Death even more so than just grief, because they're living as undertakers. Well, the husband is an undertaker. They're just living in the house. The business is in the same building as their home. And so they're living there. They are exposed to it. And then the flu hits. And things kind of just escalate very, very rapidly. This also covers the topic of World War I, that one of their neighbors, when they moved to Philadelphia, enlists in the military. That's not a spoiler. You find that out as soon as you meet him. That he has enlisted in the military and he is going to be going to France to, fight in World War I. This kind of deals with the draft a little bit, and kind of just how the war affected the community, but also how the war affected the flu. That was a big topic in here as well. And so I really, really loved the exploration of death, the exploration of grief, how each of the characters, in having their own voice, you also get to know each of their individual motivations for some of their actions, but also the way that they're handling their grief towards their little brother. So you're learning how each of them is handling it completely differently. And I love that because grief is so individual in real life. It just is. Everybody handles it differently. And I love that we see in this that grief comes in all forms, all shapes, all sizes, and there's no right way or wrong way to grieve something. As far as death goes, one of the main topics in this is the fact that death isn't necessary. It isn't bad. Death is not this, hooded figure out to get you. It's just life. And, sometimes death comes in horrific ways, and sometimes death is kind. And it's just, I love the way that Susan Meisner wrote about death was so beautiful. I don't know if you can see this. I have these book darts now, and you can see that I put them in everywhere because these quotes that she had about death and about family, I just absolutely adored. So, another thing with this book is that it is broken into two parts. So, you have the 1918 story that takes up probably 2/3 of the book, maybe. And I didn't realize this when I first got into it. I'm trying to see where part two starts. So, it's probably a little over halfway that part two starts. But part two, when you get to part two, you jump 6 years in the future. So now we're in 1925, I think. And you're kind of seeing where each of the characters is at that point and how the flu has affected them in the future. I will say I heavily preferred part one to part two with this. I definitely felt like part two was very rushed. I felt like the writing wasn't as strong in part two, and I felt like there were way too many convenient plot points in part two. I don't know. That was kind of my takeaway from this, was that I loved part one. I thought it was absolutely beautiful. And I really enjoyed part two. It kept me turning the pages. I enjoyed still hearing from each of the different characters. But I did feel like it was a little lacking compared to part one. So in part two, we briefly get exposed to the topics of mental health and what that meant back then, how they perceived mental health. Also, we get exposed to the prohibition, because at that point, prohibition was underway, speakeasies, gang life, that sort of thing. We get a little bit of that. We also get this very brief kind of exposure to what adoption might have looked like back then, and that sort of thing. We also kind of get a little glimpse into post-traumatic stress disorder, and kind of how that was perceived back then. All of these things that we know a lot more about now and have been heavily researched now, that were kind of still mysteries during this time frame. We just get a little bit of those glimpses. And so I don't feel like in part two there was as much of a central focus on one thing. It was like each daughter had their own individual storyline and their own individual thing going on. And so it's like a much more kind of broad story, whereas in the first part it's all about the flu and kind of what the family is doing all with the flu. You still get the daughter's individual characters and what they're doing, but they're all kind of focused on the same thing. Whereas in the second part, they all still live in the same place. They haven't gone their separate ways, but in regards to kind of their interests and where they're spending their time, they kind of have gone off in different directions. And so I felt like that was something that was kind of different from part one to part two. But yeah, all of that to say, I did end up giving this book 5 stars. 5 stars is a hard thing for me, but I think the way that Susan Meisner wrote and all of the central themes of the book really spoke to me, and I loved the writing style. I definitely want to read some more of Susan Meisner's work for sure. So yeah, if you have read this, I didn't want to give spoilers, but if you have read this and you would like to talk details with me, you can find me on Instagram and just shoot me a message. My Instagram handle is linked down below. It's the Curly Reader. So that's probably the best way to get in touch with me, because I don't want to put spoilers down in the comments, but general comments about this, I would love to hear down there. Also, if you have read this, I would love to know what you thought of it. And if you haven't read it, are you interested in reading it? I know it's something, like I said, that a lot of people, it's kind of come back to the forefront now, and a lot of people have been picking it up. So that's all I have to say about As Bright as Heaven by Susan Meisner. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope that you stick around and subscribe. And until next time, see ya!